Hello, what a pleasure it is to see all of you. And as a Rotarian, it is an absolute pleasure to be able to host you because, as Kim was just mentioning, Rotary is an international organization and there are unique opportunities that are available to each of you. So by way of introduction, I am the District Governor of District 6540, which represents the top 1/3 of the state of Indiana. We are also 2,500 members strong, and if you looked out across your community, you'd find a lot of the people that you know, some of your teachers, the superintendents, perhaps your mom or dad are a member of one of our Rotary clubs. But the thing is, you guys, I'm not just the district governor. We are all volunteers, and our volunteer message is to do good in the world. World Affairs is something everybody here volunteered to do to bring this message to you. So understand that, as the message up there says, Rotary International is a worldwide organization of over 1.2 million volunteers across the globe. Our mission is to build goodwill and peace throughout the world. As today's topic is immigration, note that Rotary is not an American organization. It was started back in 1905 in Chicago, but now is in over 200 countries. Our 1.2 million members are members of over 35,000 Rotary clubs. Recognize that while we're not American, we are also not having an American focus. Our job is to do good in the world. All Rotarians do not speak English. We are a non-political organization. We are in Afghanistan. We're in Poland. We're in India. We're in Ireland. We're in Australia, as Kim just mentioned, in Mexico, Spain. Keep adding the countries. And the fact is, we are all Rotarians, and that means we're a member of a Rotary club. We're all neighbors in Rotary. We're passionate about putting ourselves below the service that we perform, and we call that putting service above self. An important focus of Rotary International in our district is you. That is your welfare, your growth, and your future. As your, I'll just ask you, do any of you know, is there a Rotary club in your own community? You guys know? Actually, we've got Rotary clubs all over the place, and there's 57 clubs in northern Indiana, so most likely there is a Rotary club in your community. Recognize your local Rotary club supports scholarships, reading programs, school projects, anti-bullying, mentoring programs, sports programs. Every Rotary club is unique, but we have a common motto that we're saying, and it is a matter of leadership. So we say Rotary is a group of leaders who exchange ideas and choose to take action. So the action they do in your own community will be different based on what your community needs. Your local Rotary club offers study opportunities abroad. That's when Kim was talking about what we used to call group study exchange. Any of you guys know a youth exchange student at your school? Rotary Youth Exchange is one of the greatest programs we offer. You could be one of those Rotary Youth Exchange persons and go to another country. We have programs to help you hone in on your leadership skills to absolutely make a difference. Anybody here a member of an Interact club? Interact is international and action put together, and it is our high school programs that in essence says everything about what Rotary is doing as me as a professional, you could be doing as a high school student. We care about you, and it just makes good sense because all of you are our future. We want to help you to prepare to take care of this world that we all share. That's why we're here today. That's why we sponsor the Rotary World Affairs Conference every single year. Well, we've gathered all you bright students here in northern Indiana. We're having this same session in Valparaiso, in Hammond, Monticello, in Goshen, South Bend, and in Fort Wayne, where I'm at right now. And we're also having it in North Manchester at Manchester University. So recognize that your town's Rotary clubs have been sponsoring this conference for more than 10 years. Last year, did anybody attend last year? Last year, we talked about clean water and sanitation. Did you hear about what's happening in East Chicago? They've got water problems, lead poisoning. That's an issue in our world, is the use of clean water. Without clean water, all of us die. So today, we're talking about immigration. The year before, we talked about immunizations. because the fact is one of Rotary's biggest causes is the eradication of polio from the world. Have you all heard about polio? If you think of some of the countries or of the pictures that you see that shows the developing world, oftentimes you'll see crippled children, and they have been impacted by polio. But the fact is your parents probably gave you the vaccine, and so you all sit here comfortably in your chairs without the affliction of polio. We are very close to a full eradication of that disease with only 12 cases noted this year alone. The fact is the World Affairs Conference is addressing things that we all share as citizens of this world: global economy, climate change, outsourcing, immigration, and so on. This year we'll be focusing on immigration in the United States, as you already know. Rotary International is committed to helping the United States be the best that we can in this immigrant discussion. We encourage you to have conversations that can foster understanding within and across all of our cultures. We train adults and young leaders to prevent and mediate conflict, and in fact, we help refugees who have fled from dangerous areas. We also have 6 peace universities across the world that one of you or several of you could ultimately attend. At the forefront, though, Rotary focuses on peace. We hope you'll take away from today that you can learn much from simply having conversations with each other, through respectfully considering other people's viewpoints. We will talk about what's happening right here, right now, in the United States and in Indiana, in your own communities. As I walked in, I saw the screen up here, and I just read, oftentimes the media would have it portrayed that immigrants aren't welcome in the United States. Do you realize there's over 40 million people living in the United States that weren't born here? My husband is one of those. My mother is one of those, and you guys can probably add in. The fact is, the United States is one of the most welcoming areas in the world. Today we have 2 keynote speakers, followed by local panelists at each of the individual sites that we have. As I mentioned, Valparaiso, Hammond, South Bend, and North Manchester, along with Monticello. Our broadcast today is from the campus of Indiana University, Purdue University at Fort Wayne, now known as Purdue University at Fort Wayne. So let's get started. Our first keynote speaker is Dr. James A. McCann. He is a professor of political science for Purdue University, and he conducts research on the political incorporation of immigrants in the United States. In 2006, he began surveying Mexican immigrants about their political participation and other civic issues. He was a principal investigator for the 2012 Latino Immigrant National Election Study. He's on a team of scholars that has been collecting and evaluating survey data to better understand how Mexico is transitioning from the dominant party era to a new democratic system. He is co-author of Democratizing Mexico, Public Opinion and Electoral Choices, and he's co-editor of the official journal of the Western Political Science Association. His work has been published in a lot of leading journals, and his PhD came from the University of Colorado. After Dr. McCann's speech and a very brief break, we will then hear from a member of the College of Pharmacy, he is part of the faculty at Manchester University here in Fort Wayne. Dr. Ahmed Abdelmajid is an assistant dean of experiential education and community engagement for the College of Pharmacy. While he teaches pharmacy practice, he is focused on ensuring that Manchester's doctoral pharmacy students have successful externships, which is basically the opposite of internships, it's externships. He is a Muslim who was raised in Qatar, and he's active in interfaith conversations, panels, and events about Islam and coexistence. His family moved to Canada, where he earned his citizenship. He later moved to the United States in the year 2000 and earned his Doctor of Pharmacy degree from Ferris State up in Michigan. He's a board member of the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace, Muslim Alliance of Indiana, and United Way of Allen County. The Greater Fort Wayne Business Weekly recognized him recently in the annual 40 Under 40 Awards for making a difference in the community and in his own profession. The Indiana Pharmacies Alliance awarded him its 2017 award for outstanding community service. So, my friends, I'll tell you, there's some qualified people here to be able to talk to you about this issue we call immigration. Let's get started on our conversation, shall we? This day is all about you. You, as young people, have the greatest minds available to us now, and we want you to begin thinking about this immigration issue. We hope you'll make the most of it and enjoy it and carry on these conversations back when you get back to your school and your homes. Carry those conversations that you hear and be an active participant. The very best way that you can enjoy this session is to be active in it. Rotary welcomes you. Please seek out Rotary, Rotary.org. This is an amazing organization where we're focused on making our world a better place. I appreciate that you're here, and I'd like to welcome Dr. James McCann from Purdue University here. Enjoy your day.
Well, thanks again, everybody, for the invitation. It really is a pleasure to be here to talk to you a little bit about, my interests, what I've been doing at Purdue over the last several years. As was mentioned, I'm a professor of political science down in West Lafayette. I'm originally from Chicago, so not too far away, and I've spent most of my career at Purdue, so I've been there for quite some time. In my research life, the kinds of things I do, I focus on questions having to do with political participation, how representation happens, who's included, who's excluded. And about 10 or 12 years ago, I started looking at immigration. And the reason for that had to do with my interest in the politics of Mexico. For many years, I've studied Mexican politics. In the year 2000, I was an election observer in Mexico, so I could literally see them counting ballots, and I could watch voters vote. And about 12 years ago, Mexicans living in the United States got the right to vote transnationally, so they didn't have to return to Mexico, and they could still participate in Mexican elections. And I thought that was kind of a neat thing. We have so much discussion these days about globalized economics, but not too much about globalized citizenship. And so I started looking at this phenomenon, and the more I looked at it, the more interested I got in it. And so now the study of immigration has sort of taken over a lot of my research life. I'll plan to spend maybe about half an hour or so just talking, and then we'll have the other speaker, and then I'm looking forward to more informal Q&A and general discussion. It's customary to start any discussion of immigration by saying what one's own roots are. We heard that in the previous speaker. It's hard to talk about immigration without talking a little bit about yourself. So just in the spirit of cards on the table, let me say that my last name is Irish, but my Irish dad married an immigrant Italian lady, and that's kind of my story. So I'm sort of not too far away from the migration experience, even though I was born in Chicagoland. Okay, so you had, well, here, I'm going to frame my talk with this question: why not provide papers to the unauthorized? Okay, so I'm going to touch on a lot of current events. I'm going to talk about issues that are going to be sensitive, right? They're going to be real political. I wouldn't be a teacher of political science if I didn't believe that it's perfectly okay to talk about sensitive things and to talk about issues as adults and to really get into the weeds in terms of what we believe and what we value, okay? So what I'm going to do is unpack this question: why not provide papers to the unauthorized? Now, in answer to the question, how many immigrants are there? Well, there are about 43 million, 44 million these days. That asterisk is an estimate, okay, based on current census data. What you'll see is beginning in 1970, there was a significant uptick. Now, there were various reasons for that big uptick. Some of it had to do with changes in U.S. law, but the big drivers have to do with economic demand. We need people who can fill jobs in all kinds of sectors: agriculture, construction, hospitality. Lots of immigrants work in those areas. As a percentage of the population, it's about 1 out of 8 people living in the United States right now is foreign-born. Okay, that compares roughly to what we saw about 100 years ago in the last great wave of migration, where we saw a lot of settlement from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe. Okay, by way of comparison, Canada to the north, about 20% of that population is foreign-born. Where are they coming from? That was another one of your questions. Primarily, we're talking about Latin America and Asia. this is a slide that I got from the Migration Policy Institute. And we see that, excuse me, in 1960, primarily we're talking about European immigrants. Today, this purple line here, Asia, the blue line from the Americas. Now, turning to the real question about legal status. How many undocumented immigrants are there in this country? We've got about 11 million of them. Okay, so that's about a quarter of the total foreign-born population is undocumented. And what do you do with that population? This is the question at hand. I'm going to ask, why not authorize the unauthorized? I believe that we should. I've got some arguments here, but let me just say, in terms of public opinion, the U.S. public is generally on my side. In 2016, this, the American National Election Study, which is a big scientific social science survey in political science with lots and lots of survey respondents, the people were asked, what should we do with the undocumented population? Should we deport? Should we give them guest worker passes so they can stay here temporarily? Should we let them become citizens after they pass a background check, do some other things, pay back taxes and things like that? Or should we just let them become citizens? Okay. Now, for all the discussion these days about deportation, it turns out that the majority of the people say, let's let them track towards citizenship. Okay, if we take the two bars there, the remain in the U.S. and apply for citizenship, or eventually, become citizens without any penalties, it turns out about 2 out of 3 U.S.-born Americans say, let them stay in the U.S., okay, let them become citizens. Only not even 1 out of 5 says deport, okay? So we have a lot of discussion these days about who's included, who's excluded, but in general, in American public opinion, there is a rough consensus, yeah, let's not go with deportation. So why is it that we're having so much conversation about deportation versus letting people remain here? Well, I think there are 3 kinds of arguments that float around. You guys may have heard some of this, okay? A lot of people say immigrants take jobs away from U.S. citizens, right? Have you heard that? Has anybody ever heard that? Immigrants depress wages, okay, yeah, they're going to take the job away from you. A lot of candidates running for office, they kind of make that argument, okay? Others say that immigrants corrode the rule of law, okay, so that it's bad to be here illegally. There's something wrong with that. And still others say that immigrants somehow corrupt traditional American values. So you take people in from other parts of the world and they're just not going to fit in, okay, with the rest of us. What I want to do is very briefly go over each of these points and we'll talk. And I am conscious here, I am trying to make an argument for you guys, okay, and there's going to be a lot here to discuss. Okay, the first point I want to make is this point, do immigrants take American jobs? Now, in terms of social science, this is a tough claim to investigate. What you have to do, I put this big word here, counterfactual. Has anybody ever heard the term counterfactual? That is a mouthful. Okay, I'm not looking at any hands. You got to be really pointy-headed to throw a word out like counterfactual. Think of it as, what would the world look like if we reran it but just took all the immigrants out, right? So what is the benchmark? What is our comparison? Okay, and it's hard to do that. You can't rerun the world, but people who work in economics try their darndest to do that through their modeling and their simulations, right? They try to get this crystal ball going so they can see what will the world look like. And in that literature, there's a hodgepodge of findings. But in a nutshell, there's no strong evidence that immigrants depress wages or create a lot of unemployment. Okay, not a lot of displacement of workers. If anything, there might be a small positive effect. One study that I'm familiar with that I think is particularly telling is in 1980, the Cuban government released 125,000 of its citizens to go settle in South Florida. This was just a temporary policy of the Castro regime to open up the formerly closed borders. And so you had this big boat lift. It's called the Mariel boat lift. And all of these people, these Cubans of working age, settled in South Florida, okay? A lot of them. How many? 7% of the local labor market in South Florida, in Miami, 7% increase, which in general, that's a heck of a big increase. You just plop 7% extra workers in. So you would think with that plopping the extra workers, you would think if new immigrants displace workers, increase unemployment, and so on, you would expect to see a lot of evidence there to that. But in fact, this study here, you can think of this as a kind of natural experiment, okay? What happened was a lot of nothing. What the Miami area was able to absorb all of these workers rather smoothly. So for every displaced US-born worker that you had other opportunities that would open up. So there were all these, what economists call multiplier effects, okay, that good things happen. The immigrants come, they put out more demand for businesses. There's, you know, it can help drive employment. And so we saw no huge effect, no negative effect or anything like that in this natural experiment. So for me, this comes as close as it gets to actually running an experiment on immigration. And it said that, you know, there's not a whole lot to worry about. There's not a lot of competition. Moreover, when we look at the number of years undocumented immigrants have lived in the United States, it's relatively rare to meet a newcomer. Okay, check this out. Immigrants without papers, now these are based on census estimates, immigrants without papers, about a third of them have lived here 15 years or more, okay? So about as long as a lot of you guys have been alive, or just about, right? You've had about a third of the undocumented population living in the US. Only a very small percentage, less than 20%, have lived here less than 5 years, okay? So we are, think about all the things you've done over the last 5 years, the friends you've made, the activities you've been involved in, what you've seen your parents get involved in. Okay, what this says is that the undocumented immigrant may not have authorization to reside here, but such a person is going to be thoroughly integrated into the economy, into the local social environment. Okay, we see lots of mixed families, so that one partner is undocumented, the other is US born or has papers. Okay, so what we've got here is a thoroughly mixed bag of living arrangements. The idea that you could take 11 million people and just take them out of their communities, okay? I don't think we have an apparatus to do that. That's, you know, there's no police force that could accomplish that. But even if it could accomplish that, what I'm suggesting, it would be terribly disruptive for the economy, okay? We would all suffer on account of that, okay? So I don't see a whole lot of oomph to the argument that immigrants are taking jobs away. I think it's just the opposite. We would be hurt if we went strong on deportation. The second point, corrosion of the rule of law. How many of you have ever heard this phrase? These are things you can get on Amazon, T-shirts, coffee mugs. Have you ever seen this phrase, heard this phrase? What part of illegal don't you understand? Okay, don't talk to me about undocumented immigration. Lawbreakers need to be punished. Do you know people who talk that way? Have you heard? Okay, it's a common sentiment, and I get it. The rule of law is extremely important. We all have to follow the law, okay? But at the same time, it's absolutely the case that the law is flexible, okay? There are terms like amnesty, clemency, commutation, and pardon, okay? These words all are having to do with showing some mercy to people who break the law, being flexible, allowing people in the larger spirit of community, allowing the law to be adjusted, to show good discretion. Judges do this all the time. Some famous examples here to point to. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln, after the U.S. Civil War, by law, he had a right to have all of the rebels executed and their property confiscated. That would be within the letter of the law, and a lot of people wanted that to be done. And it's very understandable. I mean, think about it. We had the Civil War. The North paid a heavy price to recapture the South. What do you do with your rebels? Lincoln said, no, we're not going to have any mass hangings or anything like that. The rebels go back home, go back to their farms. They can keep their property. Okay, there was a big amnesty. Okay, so Lincoln technically showed mercy. Okay, he declared this amnesty in the spirit of being flexible in order to do the right thing, to do the just thing. He decided not to follow the letter of the law. More recently, and arguably not as importantly, I got out of a speeding ticket about 10 years ago. Okay, I was coming from Chicago back to Indiana. Guy pulls me up, a police officer pulls me over. I'm doing about 12 over the limit. I hadn't gotten a speeding ticket before. What did I do? I could go to driver's school. That's an online thing, okay? So that had a fee attached to it, but it's like the ticket didn't exist. Completely wiped off my record. I didn't have to pay more for auto insurance. Right now, as I sit here today, if you did a search of my records, you would see no evidence of a ticket, okay? I was illegal. Okay, I broke the law. And speeding, does anybody want to argue that speeding is not a bad thing? Of course speeding's a bad thing. There's a public safety issue here, okay? And yet I got out of it, okay, because the law had an amnesty in my case. The Internal Revenue Service, the entity you pay for your taxes, okay, or your parents are paying for taxes, they have an amnesty program. So if somebody has lots of money and they want to kind of hide it away, you know, under dubious legal circumstances offshore, this is a big issue these days we're talking about. There are a lot of these shady kinds of banking entities out in places that we can't see them, all right? Well, if you want to do the right thing, if you're in that boat and you want to do the right thing, the IRS will forgive you without a penalty. If you want to fess up, you come clean, you pay your back taxes, they're not going to throw you in jail. Okay. Well, is that right? I would say, yeah, sure. I mean, that's win-win. We don't populate our jails with people. We get a little more money for the Treasury, and people are doing the right thing, right? And they're being forgiven for it. So there's this long-standing tradition in our legal system to be somewhat flexible, right? If people are basically willing to do the right thing, the law can show some mercy towards that. Okay, if we think about illegal immigration, a couple of points I need to make. The first point is that to be an illegal immigrant in this country is historically not a violation of criminal law. In American legal circles, we have a distinction between criminal law, like if you steal something, you're breaking the law, that's a crime, versus a violation of administrative law. Okay, so to be out of compliance with a federal bureaucracy means that you are violating civil law or administrative law. Okay, and arguably, it's worse to violate criminal law. That's really what you have jails for and so on, right? The concept of an illegal immigrant, that very idea that there is such a person walking around who is perpetually subject to deportation, that concept dates only back to the 1920s. Previous to then, we just didn't have that vocabulary. We didn't have this idea. Of course, in American history, people could be kicked out of communities and so on for all kinds of reasons, right? We had lots of exclusion laws, but the idea that an individual is always at risk of deportation because he or she is an illegal immigrant, that idea is not even a century old, okay? So if we're a bit flexible in our policies towards illegal immigration, and if we show some mercy, if we declare something like an amnesty, it's hard to make the case, in my opinion, that would violate American rule of law, somehow compromise our legal system, given all of this. As I say, lots of food for thought. I'm looking forward to the discussion, but this is the way I respond when people show me, like that saying on the coffee mug and so on, what part of illegal don't you understand? One response could be, Well, there's, the law has some nuances. The law is a complicated thing. And anybody who would say such a thing to me, I'd ask them, did they ever beat a speeding ticket like I did? Okay, there are different exceptions to any law, right? Third point I want to make, and then I can turn it over. Okay. Is there a threat to American culture through immigration, and in particular illegal immigration? American political culture is deeply rooted. We have certain values like a belief in equality, a belief in opportunity, a belief in freedom, right? These are all Central American values. The value that you all should do your part. The support we give to our government institutions. Those are basic values, right? That's what it means to be an American. Well, last year about this time, I wrote a short publication for this journal. Okay, this is the title of it, Whose Commitment to the American Way of Life Needs to be Scrutinized and Questioned. Okay, and the argument I made was based on a big survey I did in 2012 called the Latino Immigrant National Election Study. This was a survey I did based at Purdue in West Lafayette, where I gathered data, original survey data, on over 1,000 Latino immigrants, where sampling was both citizen and non-citizen, including a lot of people who didn't have papers, okay? And I wanted to find out, how did they see American politics? What were they doing during the campaigns? How did their views compare to the views of other Americans born in this country? Okay? There's not a lot of political science research on this, so I felt like I was really hitting kind of fresh pay dirt here on this research program. Okay, so the name of the study is, I called it LINES. That's the logo here, which stands for, again, Latino Immigrant National Election Study. And one of the questions I asked was, when you see an American flag flying, how does it make you feel? Now, this is not some trivial question. Just in recent weeks, we've been debating an awful lot what to do when the national anthem is playing at places like football games. You've probably read the news about that, right? A lot of back and forth about whether you should stand, kneel, salute, whatever, okay? Well, with this simple item, I broke down the responses to, you feel extremely good, or very good, moderately good, or not at all good when you see the American flag. A couple of takeaways from this table, right? The first is that, boy, it is a really rare person who feels bad when they see the American flag. Most of us like to look at the American flag, right? And check this out. There's absolutely no difference in attitudes, whether we're talking about the US-born electorate, Latino immigrants who have become naturalized US citizens, Latino immigrants who are not citizens but said they entered the country with their entry papers, or Latino immigrants who say they came without papers, okay? There is not a dime's worth of difference across all of these different groups, okay? So lesson one, is there a threat to American values here? Well, on the face of it, immigrants, and even immigrants without papers, aren't out there shaking their fist at American national symbols or anything, right? They are seemingly as American as US-born Americans. What do you think about the US federal government? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it somewhere in the middle? Okay, if you want to find cynical people living in this country, don't talk to immigrants, okay? Talk to the US born, okay? Talk to people who were born here about what they think of the government. You're gonna get an earful. I'm sure you have these kinds of conversations with your parents, your uncles, whatever, around the dinner table, okay? It's as common as anything for people in the United States to criticize the government, right? I'm sure you know that, all right? I'm sure you've had those conversations, okay? Talk to immigrants, and what you're gonna find is almost, to the extreme. They have rose-colored glasses. They value American politics. They hold American government in high esteem, okay? especially immigrants who aren't citizens. Check it out. Over 7 out of 10 of the non-citizens have a positive impression of American governing institutions, as compared to fewer than 4 out of 10 of the US born. So if you want to find people who are true flag wavers, who hold American politics in high esteem, talk to those immigrants, okay? And it's going to be a breath of fresh air for you to juxtapose against all the cynicism and negativity we have floating around these days, okay? The third factoid I want to toss out for discussion: is voting a choice or a duty? Just this morning, with our other speaker, I was talking about this. Okay, opinions vary. Some people say it's a choice, right? That we have the freedom not to vote. Others say, no, it's your civic duty. You got to do the right thing in a democracy, right? Well, there's no evidence that non-citizens are actually voting illegally in this country. Okay, really, this has been looked at a lot. And there's no evidence of any law breaking on that front. But there's plenty of evidence that non-citizens think in a democracy voting is a duty, not a choice. Okay? So if you want to find a group of people in this country that feels like they owe the country a lot, that they have a high sense of civic duty, immigrants, more so than the US born. The US born, look at this, about as many people say it's just a choice as opposed to a duty. Okay, so in general, the takeaway here, I went through 3 points, three common objections to giving papers to the paperless, okay? That the immigrants somehow deprive American workers of jobs or depress wages. The fact that somebody is an illegal immigrant is a threat somehow to our rule of law and our longstanding legal traditions, or that our culture cannot assimilate effectively these newcomers. They're just too different than people who were born in this country. And in each case, what I'm suggesting here, and I realize this is a point of view here, this is just the beginning of a discussion, what I'm suggesting is that I don't see a lot of merit in any of those arguments. And those, to my ear, seem like the biggies. So if we take deportation off the table and say, let's give papers to the unauthorized, well, that still raises the question, what kind of papers? What do you want to do? You want to give them automatic citizenship rights? Do you want to give them just a, sort of temporary status of one kind or another? Do you want to try and go somewhere in between? And I'm not sure. I mean, I don't have a point of view, a firm argument to make about that. Opinions vary about what to do. Bring them in immediately to make them, if you're a US-born citizen, make them equivalent to you in politics. Okay, some people argue that. Others, notably former Governor Jeb Bush, argued in a book about 6 years ago that you should give undocumented immigrants some sort of status, but have it fall short of voting rights, have it fall short of citizenship rights. Just let them have residency paperwork, like develop a special visa so that they don't have to live in fear of deportation and they can work, but deprive them to an extent of civil rights. Okay, so no voting, no contributing to campaigns. Okay, well, that's one argument that's out there, and there are other frameworks for that. But in a nutshell, what I'm suggesting is that whatever the mechanism, whatever the paperwork we give, I think it's bad for American democracy. It's bad for the immigrants, but it's bad for all of us in this democracy to have a rather sizable group of 11 million people living this sort of in the shadowy sort of place in civil life, okay, where you don't have rights and claims the way the US-born would have, so, and naturalized citizens would have. So with that, yeah, I think I've spoken enough like this formally, but I'll look forward. I'll be hanging out during your discussion meetings, and I'll be looking forward to your comments and questions. So thanks very much, you guys, for your attention.
All right. Good morning, everybody. All right. Thank you, Rotary International District 6540, for inviting me this morning. And thank you most of all to all of you for being here and being part of this conversation. My name is Ahmed Mahmoud Rajab Ahmed Abdel Majid Salah Al Asmar. Got that? Can you repeat that for me, please? You got it? Okay. So I am also referred or known by my students as Dr. A. I'm the Assistant Dean of Experiential Education and Community Engagement with Manchester University's pharmacy program. Basically what that means, I set up all the clinical rotations for my students to be able to practice pharmacy in your Walgreens, your CVS's, independent, but also in the hospital, some research and things like that. So that's my role with Manchester University pharmacy program right here in Fort Wayne. I am an Arab American immigrant, and my journey to the United States actually started in June of 1948. I am Palestinian. My parents, in June of 1948, my father was 8 years old. My mother was about 5 when the Israeli army basically invaded their hometown of Yibna in the process of establishment of the State of Israel and basically cleansed a lot of the towns, my parents' hometown included, out of its original inhabitants. So in 1948, my father, again at the age of 8, my mother at the age of 5, moved from Yibna, Palestine, to a brief stop in Gaza, Palestine, and then ended up in Rafah on the border close to Egypt. After high school, actually before that, this picture right here, this is a house, picture taken in the mid-90s of an Arab house in the town of Yibna. I can't remember what the Israeli name for the town right now. That's the house of my grandfather that I have not seen personally. But we found this picture on the website of PalestineRemembered.com. There's a lot of documented history about Palestine in there. In the early 60s, my father, after high school, got a job opportunity to move to Qatar. And so at the age of 18, 19, he moved to Qatar, where he started working with an automotive spare parts company. As a salesperson. A couple of years later, went back to Palestine, married my mom, came back, and all my siblings and I, 5 of us in total, 2 sisters, 2 brothers, were born and raised in Qatar. I'm the youngest of 5, or as I like to tell my brothers and sisters, that I'm the one who, when they got it right, they stopped. So all the young ones in here, the youngest in your family, use that line with them. Older brothers can be abusive sometimes. I'm just kidding. So in the 60s, again, my parents started their family in Qatar. We were all born and raised there. In 1996, I graduated high school from Qatar and moved to the United States, in particular, Cleveland. On my way, I slayed a fire-breathing dragon that lived in the ocean. Got to Cleveland in 96 because my brother had just graduated Case Western Reserve University as a dentist. And 8 or 9 months later, my parents got their legal documents to move to Canada, so I moved to London, Ontario, and now we're going to move in a little bit of warp speed. In London, Ontario, I lived for 3 years, got my bachelor's in biology, got my citizenship from Canada, and then moved to Big Rapids, Michigan for my Doctor of Pharmacy degree with Ferris State University, and then in Kalamazoo for the last 2 years of that degree. And then I'm like, I want to get out of the Midwest. It's boring. Sorry, I had family. I want to live in a big city. Decided to move to Seattle. It was totally coincidental, and I'm sticking to that story, that my wife right now happened to have moved to Seattle at the same time. We got married in Seattle. A year later, my wife is like, well, I'm from Michigan. I'm from the Midwest. I miss the snow. And I'm like, I was born and raised in the desert. I do not miss the snow. Needless to say, we moved to Bangor, Maine. Lived in Bangor, Maine for about 6 or 7 years, worked at a hospital, started building a new pharmacy program, and then 6 years ago, moved to Fort Wayne with 2 kids at the time to be closer to our families. I have a brother and a sister with their families in Michigan, and my wife's family is in Michigan. So we moved to Fort Wayne, Indiana with Manchester University, building the pharmacy program. So with this quick history about who I am, you can see that in the infamous bowl of Skittles, I am a brown one. Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, born and raised in the Middle East, all the qualifiers that would land me smack dab in the middle of the brown category. Now, to the discerning mind, we got to make sure that my shade of brown is not confused with, let's say, South American brown, North African brown, or Indian brown, and of course we're talking about India, Indian, not red Indians. And to the geographically astute that can tell that, Palestine is in Asia, the yellowness of my Asian origin does not supersede all my other brown categories. Are you getting what I'm trying to say here? Of course, obviously, we've made a lot of advancement in our terminology, and I'd be remiss if I don't use some of the current terminology when we talk about people like me and don't mention the recent advancements our society have made. So I am an Arab American, Muslim American. I am, of course, a minority, further subcategorized as an immigrant, especially when you hear my slight accent that pops up every now and again, even after 21 years of living in the Western world. But in reality, who lives behind that label? I shared with you my history over the past 21 years. My father, again, was a small businessman. My mother was a teacher. We were all born and raised in Qatar, but Qatar does not naturalize you, does not give you citizenship, like majority of the Arab countries. So I lived as a refugee with a refugee travel document in Qatar. Now, when I say that, nowadays, when we hear refugees, we think about Syrian refugee crisis and tents and a lot of issues. I had what would be called a middle-class lifestyle. My parents were both employed, both had a high school education, had a good income, but I did not have any rights as a citizen or as a resident of Qatar. So education for us, for my parents, was a way of survival. You get your degree. That degree will take you places, potentially gets you a citizenship in which you have your full rights as a citizen and become a member of the society. And that's why we moved to the western part of the world. I'm also the husband of a beautiful nurse in the making. She graduates from IPFW's nursing program this December. I have 3 children, 9-year-old, she turns 9 Saturday, and 2 sons, 6 and 4-year-old, with unlimited potential in this world and what they can do in the United States. I have a lot of friends and colleagues that I've built close relationships with over the years, yet the national discourse about me and people like me reduces me down to a label that erases the human behind it and serves as a shortcut to conclusions that can be crafted and manipulated by media and politicians and others to serve as a convenient, easy answer to complex questions. A label that can be or is, as the situation is currently, blamed for everything from lack of jobs to terrorist activities, a label that completely blinds you to the flesh and bones that carry it and carry with it real concerns, aspirations, and emotions. I'm going to quote some simple data. This comes, and I'm going to read here the description of the people who collected the data. New American Economy brings together more than 500 Republican, Democrat, and independent mayors and business leaders who support immigration reform that will help create jobs for America today. Their coalition members include mayors of more than 35 million people nationwide and business leaders of companies that generate more than $1.5 trillion and employ more than 4 million people across all sectors of the economy, from agriculture to aerospace, hospitality to high-tech, and media to manufacturing. So if we look at some numbers, and this is the website right there, from Indiana in particular, we find that Indiana is home to almost 323,000 foreign-born residents. 67,000 people in Indiana are employed by those immigrants. And immigrant-owned business creates about $244 million in income in 2014. And in 2014, immigrants in Indiana earned $8.1 billion, of which $702 million went to state and local taxes, and $1.6 billion went to federal taxes. But there's also the undocumented immigrants that we hear a lot about in the news today. And the undocumented immigrants, and again, I'm quoting from the same research, they're estimated at about 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. In Indiana in particular, it's estimated at about 107,000. But 87% of undocumented males in the country were employed in 2012 and 2013. And the researchers, as they comment in their findings, that suggests to them that most immigrants came here illegally or came here without papers, came to do so because of work opportunities, not because of the other narrative we hear on the news. In 2014, undocumented immigrants in Indiana earned an estimated $1.3 billion. Undocumented immigrants also contributed to our country's entitlement programs, from Social Security contribution of almost $65 million to $84 million dollars in income and taxes. But even though I quote numbers and I quote dollars and cents, I really hate the fact that I'm having to do this, because I'm reducing it yet again to a number. I'm reducing it to something that dehumanizes the person behind what we're talking about. It is problematic. It is challenging, as Dr. McCann spoke about in his presentation. It jeopardizes the rule of law. For example, having undocumented people living in the United States. It could create, in some discussions, a shadow economy, and so on and so forth. But all these conversations, we're talking about it as this illegal person. We need to deport them. We need to build a wall. We need to do this. We need to do that. Well, we've seen from the data that more than 80% of them have lived in the United States for more than 5 years. They have lives. They have families. They have ties in this country. A lot of them children that have, came here without their knowledge that they came here without proper papers or documentation. So when we talk about this, and this is not a new phenomenon, it's been happening for at least 30 years, we need to think more about what is behind that label that's being tossed around when we reduce it down to just illegal immigrant, foreign, whatever the case may be. So we go back to the label. Let's bring it back and kind of wrap it up. It's a short, quick presentation, but the power of the label, okay? So some might argue that labeling is simply a human trait. We do it, evolutionary speaking, as a safety mechanism. Your brain thinks when you see a snake, your brain thinks danger. You either run away or fight to protect your surrounding or whatever. And it's a shortcut that our brains have evolved to do. Think about walking, breathing, driving your car. You don't think about all the steps involved. You jump to a conclusion right away once you see certain characteristics. But we as humans cannot simply be reactive to a primal instinct in our dealing with one another. When we extend this behavior to our human interactions, especially with those who do not look like us and do not go beyond the superficiality of a label, we lose the main distinguishing factor that makes us human. We lose our ability to think, we lose our ability to choose and make conscious decisions. We lose sight of the beauty that exists in our vastly different shapes, sizes, colors, and philosophies, beliefs, outlooks on life. In my humble opinion, the existential crisis that we face in the United States today is our own biases fueled by ignorance, our lack of understanding of one another, our lack of appreciation of the value of the life of the other. And it's time for us to take a deeper look at ourselves, address the politics of fear-mongering and hate, address the politics of oversimplification of concepts, and time for us to look beyond the convenience of a label. A lot of people ask me about the United States, and I liken it to one thing, and I'll wrap up with this thought. You've probably heard terms in sociology and whatever that we're a melting pot, right? The United States is a melting pot. I disagree. The United States is a mosaic. You know what a mosaic is? Lots of beautiful little pieces put together that make up one big, beautiful picture, right? Each little piece has its own defining characteristics, but it's a piece of the bigger picture. And so if we all look at each other in that sense, that we complement, we're all seeking the same things: better life, better future for our kids, for our countries, and move beyond just, I want these people out of my country, I want to build a wall to stop them from coming into the country, whatever the rhetoric that reduces, again, the human behind the label. We need to go away from that and start thinking more about how can we deal with an issue that is existent in our society today. With that, I thank you for your time, and we'll open it up for questions.
Okay, so quick question, Dr. A. So since you're not since you're not from America, did you have any like personal discriminations, like since you did have the accent?
So great question. The question is about my own personal experience with discrimination and whatnot. Not flat out, in-your-face discrimination. Some commentary that gets at potential subconscious biases or something, but I'm not the most strikingly Arab-looking person out there, and my accent is not that heavy. So after a while, I fly under the radar, if you will. The funny thing, though, my wife, who's born and raised in the United States, her father is Dutch, her mom is white, who is Muslim and wears the headscarf, she gets a lot more of the questions of, hey, where are you from? Michigan. No, from Lansing, Michigan? And it's those kinds of automatic assumption that someone that doesn't look like what you would envision an American to be is that they're not an American. So I get questions more about maybe my faith tradition, or things like that, once people realize that I'm foreign-born and things like that. But not me personally. No.
Okay, I've actually been blessed to meet a bunch of different people from different cultures. I was actually an exchange student with Rotary last year to Sweden. So I've met a lot of different people from different cultures, and I was wondering what you guys' opinion is on what would you think is the biggest problems immigrants face when coming to the U.S.?
Yeah. Okay, this is on. Yeah, no, this is a great question. And I think you have to think about the profile of the immigrant. Where is the immigrant coming from? What is the age of the immigrant? If you're a child when you come to the U.S., and I know we have some DACA students here right now, if you come at a young age and you acquire English rapidly, people in kind of the mental health professional world say that such children sometimes turn into super children, right? That they have to excel, they have to be more American than their classmates. They have to do a lot of on-the-fly translating in very technical ways with banks and medical providers and, in high-stakes environments for their parents and so on. So what happens is these super children oftentimes are super high achieving, right? They're the straight A students. They're the ones really bending over backwards to take care of things. But that's kind of a double-edged sword. So on one hand, they get the recognition that any high achiever would get, but it also is emotionally taxing. And so I know from people I've spoken with, this is outside of kind of my immediate wheelhouse, you might say. I mean, this isn't about politics, but I know people who do counseling and educators and, for young people, and what they'll report, and there is an academic literature on this as well, they'll report that, a lot of these younger people feel like the weight of the world is on their shoulders, and that can take a toll, right? So on one hand, you're super achieving. On the other hand, you think like you've got to carry the whole world on you, and that can be really a burden over the long run. So I would say for younger people, that would be among the bigger challenges. Would you like to?
Yeah, and I'll definitely echo the emotional comment. So I'm a little bit of a skewed representation of an immigrant. I had an education. I came to the United States. My older sister has been living in the United States for 25 years with her husband. So she's been here a few years before that I came, and I visited and had a little bit of a transitional acclimation to the U.S. But think about your 16 to 18-year-old. Think about all the emotional struggles that you have, from fitting in, from feeling like you belong, from all of that. Add on top of it that this person has a very distinguishing factor about them, whether a really thick accent or they don't look like the majority around you. That has an emotional toll on the person, plus the need to show that I respond. I'm the single authority on all the Muslim issues in the world. Whenever something happens, whenever any question comes up, nobody comes up to talk to me about Malala or about a couple of Nobel Peace Prize winners. Something happens and the person had a name that might sound Muslim. Hey, Ahmed, let me ask you about this. I think, I'll be quite blunt, I think black people in the room understand what I'm talking about. You're being asked to represent all the things that are going, and now it's on top of it, immigration, illegal immigration, all that. It takes a toll on you after a while, especially as a young person moving to the United States.
Hi, so I know that earlier you mentioned, like just now, you just mentioned DACA, and now that there's been recent talks about the DREAMER Act, so what do you think, and there's been debates about it, like how it's going to move forward. What do you think is going to happen, or what do you think would be like the solution to this conflict?
Yeah. Well, I think if people in Congress are honest and frank with, lots of reporting on this, that their truthful disposition is to provide some sort of relief for the DACA-affected younger people. Okay, and maybe use that as a way forward towards more comprehensive immigration policy reform. And that's true left, right, and center. I mean, but there's the sort of contrast between what might be necessary to say publicly for political reasons versus what your true value is. Publicly, it is a difficult thing to predict as we sit here now. We know that it's time limited, right? Come springtime, we know the clock is ticking. I do believe, well, for just understandable political reasons, as they say in politics, the optics would look very bad if you start deporting high potential, thoroughly Americanized immigrants. That's not what you want to see on the front page anywhere in this country. So, and Donald Trump himself, he's given very mixed signals about his positioning, but he has repeatedly said that he wants to have some sort of remedy. As the president, he would have full rights to extend DACA if he wants. It was just an executive order to begin with, so he could wake up tomorrow and extend it if he wanted. He's essentially said that if Congress can't get it done, then that's what he'll do, which, I don't know, politically we could argue whether that's wise or not, to let Congress off the hook if it can't get it done. You do want to hold the feet to the fire in some sense to get it done. But yeah, politically, this is a tough one to predict what the form will be and what kind of bargains might have to get struck. The initial bargain was if the U.S. Congress will authorize some additional security money for, and start building a wall, thereabouts. That's the kind of conversation we're having, which is going to strike many of you in the room as thoroughly distasteful, but that's the kind of compromises sometimes that happen. I think a lot of Democrats might be on board with providing more for security in one way or another in exchange for DACA protections. I think you might be able to get a majority, with a lot of Democrats involved if that's what it is. More recently, the presidential administration has signaled that it wants even more, right, in terms of policy benefits, which caused some of the main Democratic leaders to say, wait, that it looks like we're arguing here in bad faith. Right? We have this general person's agreement on one thing, and then a couple weeks later you turn around and say, well, wait, I want to push a little bit more. So the politics yet, it's not quite well formed. The lines of debate are not quite formed. It doesn't help that the ending of the period will happen right in the middle of the congressional primary election season in the spring, okay? And there are a lot of people in representing different districts in the Congress who you would think have nothing to worry about. They seem to have pretty good job security, and yet they are very concerned that if they do the wrong thing on immigration, maybe that will prompt a challenge from one direction or another. So to see the world the way they see the world, you'd have to be a little paranoid, I think, right? That's the life of a member of Congress, and which makes it very tricky to predict, unfortunately, knowing that real lives are on the line here.
Hi, my name is Dara Sanchez. I'm a senior at Snyder. And you mentioned You said the term super children, and that just kind of caught my attention. My parents are immigrants. I'm a first-generation American citizen. And then you started talking about how some people are expected to speak for their communities. And I was just wondering, what advice do you have for these super children who seem to have the sole authority within their communities on what issues they face here in America?
That's a great question. The first advice that comes to mind is actually came from a professor when I was about 19, 20 years old. He said a smart person is one who picks his fights. Okay, so there are certain things that there's no need to have the argument because the person is just trying to have an argument, and if it's not something that you're comfortable or fully aware of, you don't want to get into that because it perpetuates, it reaffirms their thought process. There are a few of those people. I don't think they're the majority. I think the majority of people are curious. Sometimes we don't know how to ask the questions that we want to ask, and it may come across as rubbing the wrong way, you know? So in my opinion, if you have the ability, if you have the comfort level, and if you have the desire to be representative of whatever that it is that you represent, and you're comfortable with that, then enjoy that role. Don't take it as a responsibility. You're not responsible for other people's actions. So whenever I'm involved in a lot of interfaith talks in Islam and things like that, and I go with the underlying premise that I'm not here to tell you what Islam is not. I'm here to tell you what Islam is, and you make your own conclusions and decisions. Because if I'm defending a point that you're making. I'm, in a way, confirming your thought process about the thing that I'm trying to do. No, we don't think that way. No, this doesn't exist in our religion. Oh, no, this is not what we do. It reaffirms that cycle and doesn't bring you to a next level of conversation that you need to have. But again, if you're comfortable with it, if you like it, if you enjoy having this conversation, I'd say embrace it as, you know, I'm in sorts an ambassador for that culture. Don't take it personally, which is hard, and that just comes with years of dealing with some colorful folks in their commentary and the way they ask the questions. But embrace it in the sense that, you know, I'm proud of who I am. And I want to talk about it. And by the way, I'm just as much of an American citizen as you are. You know, in my case, you're not going to subcategorize me into, oh, you're an immigrant or you're an Arab American or what have you. I'm embracing my role as an American while also appreciating and embracing who I am, where I come from, and speak about that comfortably. But don't get into that until you feel that you're comfortable with that conversation. That you're not getting in there losing your cool or trying to prove a point. If it's confrontational and my point versus your point, it's just an unhealthy dialogue. That's just going to end up leaving you angry or upset and leaving the other person, aha, I told you so, and we're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah, if I could just tack on to that, this is all terrific, what you're hearing. Let me just reflect on what I've observed at Purdue. For 6 or 7 iterations now over the last decade, I've worked with really great performing immigrant kids who go to Purdue. We've collected gobs of data, like kind of the stuff I was showing you about the survey. Okay, well, that national survey, I have a local equivalent, okay, where teams of students go out to these little boony towns like Frankfort, Indiana, where you've seen lots of immigrant settlement over the last few years, and they collect original data. And so I work with students who do that, and I've gotten to know these students very well. And what I've observed, they're all super in their own way. And so I think, you know, I liken being a super child to that double-edged sword. One edge is actually great, right? If you're high-performing, if you're getting all these awards, getting the scholarships and whatnot, well, that's all very commendable, and you want to keep that drive alive. The other edge of the sword is when you feel like the whole world is on your shoulders, and you're going to let your entire family down, right, if you mess this up. And nobody should live that way. What I've observed that works for super children is to get together, and the counselors at Purdue would agree with me on this, that one way to deal with stressors, super children stressors or other kinds of stressors, is get together with folks in similar boats, share stories. It's then you realize, well, the world's not going to depend on me. It's not going to fall apart without me. And just trading stories, sharing the stress, working together on projects like what I've been doing in my immigration policy class, where the students all go out in little teams and get all this great fresh data, and then we analyze it and we write it up and post it to blogs and things like that. Okay, they enjoy it, but I also think that's just good emotionally, right? To counteract that other edge of that sword.
All right. I'm Stefan from Northside High School. I'm a senior. This question might be a bit packed, but I was wondering, say, like the first speaker, you were talking about amnesty and how we should document undocumented citizens. Say if there was a period of amnesty and government set up stations across the country to document those people, what protections should the government have for those people? Because legally they would be protected as any other citizen, but as you've seen in like Brown versus Board of Education, the president had to send down National Guard to protect students that want to go to desegregated schools. So would a similar effect happen for these immigrants? What would you think?
Very, very, very interesting question. Wow. I thought you were going to go in a different direction on that one. Okay, well, first, there are different, quote, amnesty or whatever. I mean, this is all just very unconcrete kinds of theorizing right now. The closest analog was in the 1980s. There was an amnesty under Ronald Reagan. This was in 1986. There were a number of undocumented immigrants in this country, and nearly 3 million of them got a visa to reside here, and that eventually could lead to citizenship rights if they wanted to go that route. Okay. In the aftermath of that, there was not this sort of violence that there was not a need for federal marshals to protect, to integrate. I think largely because a lot of the undocumented population is already fairly well integrated into whatever community they are. The only thing they don't have is this kind of administrative identity, right? So when you change that, you open up a variety of different rights and opportunities, but on a sort of everyday living level, you don't necessarily change a whole lot.
Yeah. You don't know who they're undocumented.
Yeah, yeah.
You can't tell who's undocumented unless they come out.
Right. You get 10 people, 3 of them don't have documentation. It's hard to pick them out in a lineup. Okay. Now, that being said, there are some scenarios that are interesting that would involve conflict, and not necessarily the kind of bloodshed conflict, but partisan conflict that might be new. Should we give voting rights, say, to 11 million fresh voters? What happened in the aftermath in the 1980s when a lot of immigrants got voting rights? Okay, there was a backlash in California. California used to be a rather mixed state between Democrats and Republicans. It was pretty evenly divided. The Republicans, now if you know anything about California politics, you know the Republicans are the minority party. It's a pretty solid Democratic state. And one reason for that is the Republican Party in the 1980s and 90s, following this reform, the Republican Party went down hard against the reform and took a strong stance against immigration. So the current kind of political divide between Democrats and Republicans more or less dates to the 1990s, and a lot of it started in California in response to some of these newer immigrants, right, becoming a bit more visible. And so if we think of that as a sort of rough model, it's interesting to imagine how party politics in this country might change if all of a sudden you have a not unsubstantial group of people, right, who now can lay some claim, right, and now might have voting rights. The parties would surely respond, and that might change our discourse. It might improve our political discourse. Actually, it might make things a little more interesting, a little less polarizing, okay, perhaps, but it would change the nature of conflict. I wouldn't expect to see anything like, what was alluded to, turning fire hoses on immigrants and things like that, analogous to the civil rights years. That seems hard to imagine, but I can imagine some interesting political ripple effects if there was a greater degree of civil incorporation.
What debt well, what threat did DACA impose that it had to be taken away? Like, why did they take it?
Oh, why? Yeah, why was DACA taken
Yeah.
away? Yeah, boy, that's a, you got to get inside the minds of some. Yeah, the strategic motivations are, well, there might be a few. Okay, Donald Trump ran on a platform that was hostile to some interests of immigrants. Sorry, I mean, and he has a constituency that. You know, on the slide, you'll recall about a little bit less than 20% of the American public last year wanted to deport rather than regularize the paperwork. But a disproportionate number of those people would fall in the Trump camp, okay? And so some of it is just being responsive to those kinds of interests. And this is an easy one. The reason why DACA in particular is, you know, coming into view is because that's an easy one for the administration. It's DACA in the first place started as an executive order under President Obama. And what that means is it's not congressional action, it's just in the White House that Obama single-handedly did it. He tried to get more comprehensive immigration policy reform, and Congress just can't get it done, right? I mean, there are so many different friction points that it's tough to get anything like a majority consensus on that. That would involve, you know, giving paperwork to across the board, but also maybe increase some of the security in the country and maybe fund some ESL schools. And so, you know, there are just a lot of different moving parts there. So the government couldn't get it done. Obama just pushed DACA on his own, and President Trump has a right to unpush it, right, to remove it. So think of it as maybe the low-hanging fruit, right, if you want to be responsive. So I guess, yeah, that would be the main driver.
Yeah, I mean, you hit two birds with one stone, politically speaking. One, it's an executive action by President Obama, and a lot of the political discourse and campaigning was against this authoritarianism of, you know, this single executives. With the swipe of a pen, he's making an order that's affecting lives and whatever. So Trump and a lot of the, I think, Republican candidates, if I remember, ran against that platform. And then low-hanging fruit of immigrants, children of illegal, quote-unquote, illegal undocumented immigrants. You can tie it to economy, they're impacting, they're taking our jobs, you know, hyper-emotionalize the situation. So to gain some political capital, low-hanging fruit, I just, you know, I erase that and have my voter support or base support in that, and I win some brownie points with them. Unfortunately, that's what it's come down to.
Yeah, let me also just to very briefly tack on to that. When we look at the potential presidents that this country could have had on the Republican side, you might recall over a year ago during the presidential primaries, boy, anybody who could name the more than a dozen presidential White House seekers out there, you would deserve a gold star. There were a lot of people running for the White House last year, okay, on the Republican side. Trump was maybe close to unique. He might have been in terms of his own stance on immigration and international politics, okay? So I think the world would be very different now insofar as DACA is concerned if we had, say, President Jeb Bush, right? We would not be having this kind of conversation even with a Republican president. Jeb Bush, as I mentioned very briefly in the talk, Bush came out about 6 years ago with a book where he said basically, let's not deport people without papers. Let's not make it easy for them to naturalize and become U.S. citizens, right? If they're here without papers, then they should pay some penalty. But so stop short of giving them full citizenship rights, but do not, you know, stop the deportation. Give them a special visa or something like that, right? And had we had the third President Bush in the White House right now, I have to think that would be, you know, a rather doable proposition for Congress.
My name is Panashi, and I'm a senior at Homestead High School, and my question is mainly for Dr. McCann. You mentioned in your presentation that a lot of immigrants hold a very high opinion of the U.S. federal system, and my question is, to what extent are immigrants, undocumented and documented, subject to due process of law?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. To a large extent. Okay, so the First Amendment and the freedoms in the Bill of Rights and so on, they apply to residents. Okay, and in fact, this is a sidebar to your question, but even congressional apportionment, every 10 years there's a census conducted, and that helps redraw congressional district lines, right, as we apportion the Congress, the House of Representatives members. Every resident, including residents without papers, is counted. And in principle, the implication is that members of Congress are tasked with representing everybody, right? Not just voters, but undocumented immigrants, documented immigrants who aren't citizens, children who can't yet vote, right? All this. Making a big distinction between foreign-born or foreign-born without papers versus others, that isn't a distinction that's consistent in an awful lot of American law and legal traditions. Okay, so in terms of most of the freedoms that we would automatically assume we have and use actively, right? In principle, they do apply to everybody, okay? Immigrant, non-immigrant. Now, in practice, and this is where there's a bit of a limbo area here. I don't want to paint too rosy a picture. Violations of administrative law, which is primarily what lacking documentation is, okay? You go to an administrative court, and you might be in a detention center where you may never see counsel, and they may not give you the conventional Miranda rights. You may not, right? I mean, it's just, if you're hauled in because you're a speeder, right, you can expect to have certain rights respected. But if you're taken into custody because you lack residency papers, it gets a little sketchy. There is a gray area. There are a lot of civic groups throughout Indiana and throughout the country, actually. In Lafayette and West Lafayette, I know specifically of a group that does this. They'll have laminated Know Your Rights cards, bilingual, maybe in Fort Wayne there's something like this. It's common. I know in Logansport they do this, where local organizations, churches and economic organizations, service providers and so on, will literally pass out these little wallet-sized Know Your Rights cards to everybody, so that when you're detained, if you're detained, what do you say? What shouldn't you say, right? What are your rights? And you can be a little assertive because you can't be assumed in all cases that you might have counsel who can represent you in those kinds of proceedings. So, yeah, so there's a kind of shadowy nature to a lot of this, and there are serious issues of accountability that can get raised. It's even, things on the horizon, I know you're not asking about this, but relatedly, what we're seeing is an expansion of sort of administrative service providers, detention centers that ostensibly are private, right? The contract-based service providers to house immigrants who are detained. You see this in places in the Southwest primarily. And there it's even a sort of further out layer in terms of political accountability, right? If it's a private contractor who is tasked with housing people who aren't technically prisoners, right? Because they haven't been tried yet or anything like that. But it is possible that the treatment's going to vary. There might be some bad treatment in some places. So I'd like to say that the principles that are rather long-standing in this country about equal representation, I'd like to say that those principles are always true, but in practice, yeah, there's a lot of variability.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, financially, what were some hardships you faced when going for college or, going for a job and so forth? Because I know most undocumented immigrants have a very difficult time finding high-paying jobs of any sort, so that limits their chance of getting support to go to college.
So I don't fall in the category of undocumented, so at the same time, I come from a culture where parents pay for your education. I did have a little bit of a different start to my pharmacy program, because at that time my father got laid off from, he was 60-some, gave him early retirement, basically laid him off from his company in Qatar. It did a couple of things, because if you lose your job in Qatar, you lose your right of residency, because you're a resident as long as there's a sponsor, there's an employer for you. Thankfully, we had friends and family that helped in that regard, and my parents stayed, but I went the route of I'll take loans for paying for college. But I was Canadian at the time, going to school in the United States, so I paid out-of-country, out-of-state tuition. I approached it as, if I'm eligible for the loan, I'll take it because that's an investment in my future. And I'll be able to be at a better place to pay it back once I graduate with this degree, rather than settle with a bachelor's or something that doesn't afford me the job that I needed, again, for survival as an immigrant here. So it was tough, because I needed a private loan, and I had a co-signer to sign it with me, so I had to have my brother-in-law. Actually trusted a 20-year-old enough to co-sign on close to $100,000 loan to pay for my degree. But again, I'm blessed in those ways, but it definitely was stressors, and I had to budget and think about where I'm spending my money, how I'm spending it, and what the ultimate purpose of all of that was. So.
Maybe over here? Yeah.
Mr. McCann, you talked about the three main concerns that individuals that are pro-deportation have. How do you respond to those people, even after witnessing the research that you have conducted?
Sorry, I want to make sure there was a bit of an echo.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, could you repeat the first part?
The three main concerns that you talked about, how do you respond to that?
Oh, yeah, okay. That's just, those three, yeah, first of all, the three, that's not necessarily covering all possible concerns, but to my ear, those seem to be the three biggies, okay, when I listen to news and read editorials and so on. Yeah, the economic argument is difficult, and I say this as a guy who teaches social science statistics, okay, that's one of the hats I wear at Purdue. And I threw out that fancy word counterfactual. It is difficult, right, to get the right comparison point. You have to do this hypothetical, rerun the world, take immigrants out, see what difference that would make, okay? And to build a good circumstantial case is tough, okay? So, which means that there's always room to argue, right? So some people, well, okay, you say something and then somebody can turn around, yeah, but my brother-in-law just got fired because of blah, 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 right? And so, it can be difficult to change minds when somebody is dug in on a particular viewpoint. As an academic, right, and I gave a talk that was framed around advocacy. I do truly believe in the bottom line that I was conveying. But I do try to keep the academic hat on and be true to the analysis. And so I will admit that all of our sort of inferences about economics and so on, they're necessarily bounded and tentative, and that's just the nature of the beast. So so I try not to be overly assertive. I try to be mindful of the limits in what I can argue, and bring up examples like with that Muriel boat lift, right, which is the closest I know of to an experiment in the real world, right? Can you change minds? Well, I mean, if somebody is arguing based on stereotypes or something, it's really difficult. It's especially hard, right, when I start comparing having a lack of documentation to speeding or something like that. And I've had conversations where I say, actually, in my opinion, speeding is worse. That if I had to think about what's worse for society, undocumented immigrants who are otherwise obeying the law, they're not going to hurt me, right? But a speeder might hit me or something, or hit my car or something like that. I mean, that's a violation of a criminal statute and so on. So when I have those kinds of conversations, it's easy to hit a wall, right? So, some people just think, no, there's something somehow, there's something sacred being violated or whatever. And a lot of this links in, maybe in some cases, and it's hard to read minds, but maybe in some cases, it's because of maybe ethnic fears, apprehensions about, multicultural pluralism. So for instance, of the 11 million more or less, undocumented immigrants, something like 75% of them are Latin American born, okay, as a rough estimate, okay? So just imagine if we were talking about 11 million undocumented Norwegians, would we be having the same kind of conversation? I don't know that, but I suspect behind those concerns, there might be some deep-seated concerns about just their own cultural identity and position and fears, understandable fears. And I don't want to put anybody down or, and insult them or anything like that for their beliefs. I do try to understand when I'm engaged in an argument. And if you can't change minds, at least if you can end on a respectful kind of footing, I think that's a victory, because it's so easy to just deadlock and start shouting, okay? In terms of the third argument about, who's more American and so on, there I do feel comfortable letting the data speak for itself, right? I mean, I collected it, I know what it says, it gives a nice point of comparison, and if somebody wants to say, well, I'm not capturing the right kinds of concepts or what, well, so be it, or my social science isn't what they would have it to be or something. Okay, we can have that kind of argument. Those kinds of arguments in academics are a heck of a lot more manageable, right? Because then you're arguing about research designs and things like that. And once in a while you can get to like the right answer, then you can have a meeting of the minds. But I think with something like immigration, boy, just be if this comes up over your Thanksgiving table or something, right? Just be aware that you are stepping into a loaded place, right? Whatever people think, chances are they think it strongly when it comes to immigration. But also, chances are they have a lot of cross-cutting considerations, right? So, when you think about economics, you may think one thing, but when you think about other kinds of features of immigration, you may think something else. And so that can make conversations very interesting, or it can make those conversations very frustrating too.
Thank you.
Hi, this also is mostly directed to Mr. McCann. However, either one of you are eligible to answer this question. So Mr. McCann, you talked about your opinion on just giving people amnesty or giving people papers. But if you supplied papers to everyone who was either in the United States or wanting to come into the United States, whether Latin American born or otherwise, what is the difference between that and having open borders? So with your idea, is that providing amnesty to those already here or to all coming? And if it is to all coming, then what's the difference? And then if there is no difference, then what are the security implications with having open border policies?
No, great question. I mean, countries are distinctive. There's long-term traditions and practices. Under any scenario I can imagine, and certainly under any scenario that might be remotely politically doable, you wouldn't just wave a wand and give somebody papers, okay? There would be an extensive background check. If back taxes needed to be paid, they'd be paid. If there are other legal issues that have to be resolved, they'd be resolved. In my opinion, that is a big difference from let's get rid of the Border Patrol or whatever, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I see that. I mean, quote, amnesty, right? If we equate a lack of deportation with, quote, amnesty, it would be amnesty with lots of conditions. And that's something I could personally, if I were going to put on the advocate hat, that seems extraordinarily reasonable to me. It's that, you've got, and that percentage of people with an actual record, okay, or people who represent a threat, yeah, presumably there would be some measures, some protective measures. You mentioned security. Yeah, without a doubt. I don't think it's healthy to pit one value against another. So kind of fairness or social stability versus security, that seems kind of dysfunctional.
Yeah. And it's also, to add on that, it's not one or the other. So granting amnesty, let's say, doesn't necessarily mean that we're going into the open border situation. What we're dealing with right now is there are 11 million people that are here. Right. We can't ignore that fact, okay? How they got here without papers or illegally or whatever, there's questions that need to be asked about what were the reasons. Nobody leaves their home just to come here. There's a reason that prompted you to come here. Still, I agree. I went through the whole immigration process and everything and paperwork and paid my dues, and they lied to me. They said when I become an American citizen, I don't have to pay taxes anymore, and I'm trying to fight that. They're falling asleep. Okay, so, but back to the point of, yeah, I mean, when I find, I'd be like, I'll have a hard time with that. Why did I go through all of this and then all of a sudden? But what we need to do is look at the issue that we have, 11 million people here, and the stratification of did they come here of their own accord, were they born and raised here, and all of these things. And then also look at, okay, well, how did they get in, if that's a concern for us to try and stop that, and while still providing the legal and proper way to do it. You know, there's legal and proper way to immigrate to the United States as well. But building a wall as a simple solution to something is not gonna work. And then again, let's address what we have here with all the complexities that come with it, and then also looking for the future. How do we prevent ourselves from getting in a situation like this when we're asking? So it's not an open border argument too. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe over here.
You've talked a lot about immigration or immigrants in the country now, but what do you think about securing the borders and making sure that illegal immigrants in the future don't come in and continue these arguments for people who are like, oh, immigrants are all terrible, because it's not true, obviously. But I think the best way to eradicate that is making sure immigrants aren't illegal and they come in here correctly. So what do you think is the best way to go about that?
Yeah, let me jump in on that. It turns out just, you know, with the 11 million more or less undocumented immigrants in this country, approximately half of them are undocumented because they overstayed a legal visa. Okay, so think like student comes over, business worker comes over or something, and then just, you know, is out of compliance and stays that way, right? Because they get encumbered, they get a wife, or they do all the normal things of life, right? So a wall would not mean anything for that population, okay? In terms of a wall, you got to figure, well, where do you want to build that wall? I mean, presumably it's between U.S. and Mexico. The reality is, even without a wall, there is no net migration. This has been true for a couple of years from Mexico to the U.S. Okay, I mean, just it's people who count these things, right? I mean, there are border apprehensions; those continue, and so on. But when we just look at the sort of, you know, Mexican population in this country today, it's holding steady, and that's been true for years. So it is misinformation to say that the country is being overrun. There's just not evidence for that right now. The number of undocumented immigrants has held steady in this country. It's not been rising. About 10 years ago, it started to creep up, and the 11 million mark was hit several years ago. And now, if anything, it's going slightly down, okay? So this is, in my opinion, from a policymaking standpoint, this is not a kind of your hair is on fire sort of scenario or anything like that, right? In a sense, the, quote, problem is taking care of itself. Or to the extent there's a, quote, problem, I'm not sure a wall would be relevant, okay? What would be relevant? I mean, there are a lot of things. I suggested having a special visa of some sort, or regularizing, tracking towards citizenship. Yeah, that would take care of the undocumented issue. And then going forward, perhaps building some flexibility into, I mean, right now there's a cap on the number of visas that can be issued. And it's hard to change that cap. It's a matter of law, and getting things through Congress is just hard. So might we think of a policy-making entity, right, that, or some regime, right, that might build some flexibility into it depending on economic demands for labor or other kinds of contingencies. I mean, there's a lot we could do so that we don't force people, you know, 20 years down the line to also be living in shadows. I agree, that is to be avoided. And so how do you avoid that by, you know, redoing some of the policies now? And that's where a lot of politics comes in, right? That's what you're paying your lawmakers for. And but in the here and now, it just seems like the wall, I'm not sure what problem the wall is meant to correct, you know, and certainly given the substantial investment that would create. I mean, in terms of, you know, you can equate that to other municipal projects, public works projects, and so on. And you got to ask yourself, where's the better bang for that buck from a policy standpoint?
And I mean, using the terminology of securing the border is making the assumption too that we have this evil entity coming through. I mean, illegal is one thing, but the assumption that, I think the quote is whatever, rapists and druggists and drug dealers and things like that, we have that a lot more organically grown in the United States than coming across our borders. So yes, I understand that we need to be protective of our resources. You know, we need to be more selective in who's willing and able to assimilate within our, you know, the American value system or what have you, but it's not the overwhelming majority. It's not even a huge majority within illegal immigrants that fall into that category of, we need to worry about those people. I mean, yeah, they broke a law, but it's, again, overstayed a visa or something else, and we need to look at ways to remedy that, one, to stop it from happening, and also to deal with the issue that we already have on our hands.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brandon Crable. I'm a senior from Snyder High School, and recently, in recent years, there's been a lot of hate in politics, particularly concerning immigration. Recently, I watched a documentary that kind of investigated certain political figures will hire certain businessmen and alike that will incite like insane rhetoric on TV. For example, like Roger Stone. And that documentary did not really call into question what the effect that had on immigration. So my question to you is, how does political fear-mongering influence the process of immigration, and what changes does it pose to future immigrants, current U.S. citizens, and future political campaigns?
I mean, he can answer the political implications, or the legal and political implications of it. I'll tell you the implications of having that political rhetoric pushes a lot of people in the further into the I don't belong frame of mind. Okay, and that's, I'd say, a lot of immigrants who, especially that, like me, first generation American, that came here at a later age, you always have this inner dialogue that, you know, do I belong? Am I an American now? Am I not? And whatever. And that further pushes you into the you don't belong, you're not one of us kind of mentality, and all the baggage that comes with that. There are others that, you know, for example, like myself, I like to engage in these conversations, because if we don't, then we're going to get overrun with this one thought process, this, again, labeling, this categorizing, putting people in a box and what have you, and that's just dangerous for the society as a whole. So from the receiving end, having this rhetoric actually pushes me more towards running for office as opposed to running away from it. You know, just to challenge the notion that, you know, I'm not a full American citizen. I don't like the hyphenated American. I'm American. Why do you call me Arab American, African American, Mexican American, and then you're American? You being, you know, the white male and what have you. You know what I'm saying? Yes. All of that further subdivides in categories, and it's just not healthy overall. So a lot of us would challenge it, but the majority, I think, go further into that, well, I'm just not an American, or not enough of an American.
Yeah, let me jump in very briefly, and we all might have just heard the first draft of a campaign announcement. I'm not sure. Okay, so we'll have to wait and see on that.
When they're working and they can donate money.
So we'll have to see. Okay, yeah, I share what I think you're expressing, the fears you're expressing, and it's, boy, I mean, it's the age we're living in, where you can have this rumor mongering across social media, and people, some of them are so rattled that they take guns in hand or whatever. They can do some very outrageous things. So therefore, what to do? Not only about immigration, but the sort of nature of political discourse these days. Yeah, there are going to be provocateurs everywhere, and some of them are going to be on somebody's payroll. Some of them might just do it for the sake of doing it, because for some reason, okay, that's always going to be there. This may or may not be reassuring to you, but the individuals who wrote the American Constitution were very mindful of this liability. And one way to understand the entire rationale for checking and balancing and dividing power and putting a little distance between lawmakers and the public is that you wanted to diffuse some of that, right, by all of this architecture there. That's at least, you know, I'm channeling James Madison here, right, who wrote the first draft of the Constitution. So putting the political science hat on, one could argue that the problem should be self-correcting. At least that's the theory, that over the long run, you'll see these provocateurs hit a wall. They'll provoke as much as they can provoke, and then they're just going to go away, right? When they don't get a hearing, when they don't get satisfied, they'll go back to wherever they came from. So that's maybe the optimistic scenario. We can also say that there are lots of social sanctions, right? That there's, in the aftermath of the shootings and even the attack yesterday in New York, if you followed the news, right, which is a very different sort of thing. But my own sense, and there's some polling data to suggest that, is that Americans are being more mindful and more willing to talk to each other and call each other out. And so some of this might be self-correcting aside from government institutions. Okay. In the meantime, until it self-corrects, what to do? Okay. Well, realize your own blind spots. Okay. Realize the ways that you can be. Anybody can be manipulated, right? So just self-awareness, knowing that, you know, each of us can be easily led down the wrong path, and I think it's a sign of self-knowledge and maturity to know what is that, what, you know. Who can lead me on, and to inoculate yourself against that. And then get engaged yourselves. I mean, you all are here at this conference, okay, so that I know just by looking at you that says a lot about you. You're all going to be community leaders in your own circles, right? So keep that alive as well, because you guys are the next generation. So if you want to be optimistic, if you want to channel James Madison and the constitutional framers, then you might take some solace in saying, you know, we've been down this road. We've never had Facebook before, you know, like we're seeing it today. But we have seen provocateurs. You can go back to the 1800s and even before then and find all manner of rabble-rousers and their version of fake news floating around and everything. So this is not new, and that might be reassuring even though it's nasty to look at.
Thank you.
How big of an impact do you think the government, improvements of technology and medicine, and war have on immigration, or what do you believe is a main cause for immigration?
The main cause for immigration?
Yes.
Is that, okay.
I can start out and you can tack out of it. Yeah. Okay, in terms of, you might remember that initial graph I showed. So starting in the kind of 1960s and 70s, the number of migrants settling in the US really shot up. And that's a similar story to, like if you go to Britain, go to Canada, and so on, you could find similar sorts of trajectories. Okay, so the drivers. In the American context, there was a change in just federal policy, right, that relaxed quotas that had been previously in place. So we took a kind of lid off of migration and allowed, especially for more family migration. So law matters. But the bigger driver really was economic demand. Okay, so one thing that in my reading, one thing that I saw just the other day, in the agricultural sector in this country, a quarter of the workforce is undocumented immigrant. Okay, I mean, that's just an astoundingly large number. And the reason why it's undocumented is because under federal law, there's a cap on the number of work visas that you can get. But if demand surpasses that cap, well, the demand is going to be met one way or the other. Okay, so I think economic pulls, and then some family pulls as well. So if you settle in the 70s and 80s, you want to bring over your mom or whatever, you know, that's rather common. But yeah, the economic pull, I think, and also then Cold War politics entered in as well in an interesting way. The Cold War is long gone, thankfully, but in the 70s and 80s, the Americans in particular went out of their way to welcome people from the Eastern Bloc, right, the old Soviet bloc, calling them refugees, right, by definition if they're coming from the Soviet system. And so they were very proactive in stoking those migrant channels.
Thank you.
All right, so my question is specifically aimed at your presentation, but I think you both would be well equipped to answer it, and it has a little bit of buildup. So in your presentation, you had that most Americans were in favor of legalizing immigrants with certain conditionals. And one of the conditionals was that they learn English. I would ask, is it morally correct for us to place upon these people they have to learn English, otherwise you cannot receive these rights? Or is that just another form of a test to take that makes it so that you can't vote?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, the language. We, of course, have no national official language. This isn't Canada, right, where you have to police your language and make sure you always have French and English side by side. I would say that's one of the virtues of this country. And, you know, go throughout the country and you're going to hear a lot of different versions of English, boy, and everybody thinks they're speaking English, okay? So we have no official kind of policing of that. Learning English is already a condition for naturalization. So if you want to become a citizen, if you're foreign born, you want to become a citizen, it typically takes 5 or more years to do it. You've got to pass a civics test, so they'll ask you various things about the branches of government and things like that, and you've got to demonstrate at least bare bones English proficiency. Now, if we take the common practice as a model, there are a lot of, I mean, if you look at Spanish language television, and we get that as part of our cable package, what you'll see is a lot of advertising for like English without barriers and things like, you know, a lot of adult ed things. So the immigrants themselves get it, that they need to learn English regardless of whether they're going to naturalize, right? I mean, if you want to get ahead in your work life, you know, you got to get at least the rudiments of English down. If you moved to Mexico, you'd say the same thing about your Spanish speaking ability. So that's already kind of happening, even though we lack an official language. So my sense is that since there's already a template for naturalization and expectation of English proficiency, that's not really breaking new ground in those conditions. And as an aside, let me just mention that in some of the surveys I've done in the past, I asked immigrants themselves about bilingualism, or, you know, would it ever be right to sing the U.S. national anthem in Spanish, for instance, right? Because once in a while you see people doing that. And overwhelmingly, they say, well, no, you know, and overwhelmingly, even though there's no official English language in this country, the immigrants themselves say, you know, acknowledge that English is the common language, and they realize that they should learn it. The kicker, the impediment to that is not a lack of willingness. Any of you who have studied a second language, I'm sure can appreciate that it's just hard to learn a second language, and it's hard to really get proficient in it and to keep proficiency, right? I mean, you tell me if I'm wrong on that. It's just true. Well, imagine if you're 30 years old or something and you're trying to do that and also work and raise a family. So the fact that people might hear Spanish, you know, when they're pumping gas and the guy in the next car over is speaking Spanish on a cell or something like that, right? That's just not because there's any hostility to English. It's just because it's hard to get conversant in English. But I think from an administrative standpoint, the threshold for demonstrating proficiency is known to be rather approachable.
And basically, it's a matter of functionality to learn the English language, because it's the language most spoken in the United States. You know, I still speak Arabic. I love the Arabic language and all that comes with it. But I understand that if I don't speak English, then I won't be able to perform my job, or I won't be able to go about my daily life. So even though we don't have an official national language.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Earlier, when you were speaking about amnesty and pardons and all that, what does the system of that look like to you? And if a system is feasible and can be put in place, should it somehow extend to people that have been deported prior to the system being?
Oh, yeah. Okay, good question. And I was just told, I'm afraid, that has to be the last question. I think this question is coming between you and lunch. So it'll have to be the last one. Yeah, in terms of mechanisms, that's a good question, and you would need one big crystal ball to figure that out. Yeah, in terms of if there were some sort of amnesty conveyed, we could use the comparison maybe to the 1980s. And what happened then is there was a congressional act that was passed, and then you had a lot of kind of grassroots offices empowered and funded, right? There were intake offices and lots of paperwork, a lot of applications. And then back then, there were conditions, right? So you had to pay any back taxes. You had to do a lot of the things that are currently being considered. So that would not happen overnight. And it would be a big, like, this would talk about a good summer job for anybody out there, right? Being an intake person, helping with processing that paperwork, there would be a lot of demand for that. And so it would be years, not months, to accomplish. Now, I have no idea, right? So people who were recently deported, might they have some claim, especially if they were deported after a decade of residence in the US or something like that? Yeah, I mean, I have to think that under any scenario, there would be lots of conditions attached, like the reason for deportation. If the reason is a criminal record or something, right, then I have to think that, you know, that would be taken into account. So, yeah, this is all very hypothetical at this point. It is true that if you look at polling data, and I showed you, one state-of-the-art survey, but it'd be easy to find 12 others to support that. It is true that, in general, the majority of Americans do not want to have some deportation force that just takes people out and casts them away, okay? But what the alternative is, you know, how do we regularize everything in some fair way and some rather efficient way, right? So we're not having this conversation for 20 years or something. Well, you know, devils are in details, and that is still a conversation to be worked on.